And this morning, we have Dr. Joel C. Gregory, who is the preaching professor at Truett Seminary and is also a former pastor of the First Baptist Church of Dallas and president of the state convention in Texas, and one of the premier preachers in our nation, and just thankful for him taking the time out to be with us. And what he has done is he has recorded 45 minutes of teaching, and then he will come on live in about 45 minutes to answer questions, and then he will go off and then play another 45 minutes of teaching and instruction, and then he'll come back on again live to field any questions or comments that we may have for him.
What a delight it is to join today with my good friend and your moderator, Reverend Dr. Damone Johnson, and the people of the Hudson Valley Association for this time of continuing education in biblical preaching. It's a delight on this bright Monday morning to join with you, my friends, for these two sessions in which we're going to discuss some principles of biblical preaching. I'm delighted to be part of this and to share in this way with you. These will consist of two approximately 45-minute sessions, and at the end of each session, we'll have time for live Q&A from those of you who are participating. Incidentally, the outline for this is called Standing on the Razor's Edge. Now, why would I call discussing preaching standing on the razor's edge? That's a kind of sharp metaphor, isn't it? When you stand to preach, you have in one hand the past biblical revelation, Holy Scripture, God-breathed over 1,500 years. On the other hand, you have the current human situation, not just generally or globally or even nationally, but the current distinct human situation in your own church, just as your church is, just where it is. The past biblical revelation, the current human situation. However you do your preaching, it's agreed that preaching comes together when you bring that past biblical revelation and this current human situation together, preaching in the specific venue where you preach. And that's where the challenge rests. The past biblical revelation was given in Hebrew and in Greek over a period of 1,500 years in the world that was over there and then, in the world that was there, then was. But you, on the other hand, are in the world not there but here, not then but now, not was, but the world that is. And by any definition, when you're doing distinctively biblical preaching to a congregation, it needs to bring those two together at the hardest point, right in between the two, where you hold the past biblical revelation in one hand, the current human situation in the other, right there, wherever you're preaching in New York or in that vicinity. And that's what I want to talk about in a few minutes today. Standing on that razor's edge, the hardest place to stand. In many ways, it's easier to fall off toward the past biblical revelation and act as if you were still living in Galilee or Jerusalem 2,000 years ago, or to concentrate entirely on the current human situation, as fraught with difficulty as it is in the living of these days. And we all know what those difficulties are. But to bring the two together is what biblical preaching is about. So let's talk about that. First of all, how do you get started in terms of biblical preaching? Well, one thing is to understand that you may take one of two approaches in getting ready to preach. You may start with the biblical text in your own devotional reading, reflection, rumination, chewing the cud. You have been gripped by a text. That word on the biblical page jumps off the page, if you want to put it that way, leaps off of Scripture and becomes a burden to you to preach. There you're starting with the past biblical revelation. But on the other hand, in the living of these kind of days, we have all kinds of challenges in the present human situation. Once again, I don't know that I need to iterate everything in the life of our nation and the life of our churches that is a challenge in the present. Now, here's the clue. Whichever end you begin on, past biblical revelation or current human situation, you need to get to the other end as quickly as you can. If you're dealing with injustices today in our society, and certainly there are, as quickly as you can, you want to take that to a passage like from Amos, let justice roll down like waters, or any other passage. On the other hand, if you're looking at Amos chapter 5, you want to get that as quickly as possible to the current situation so that you wind up holding both in the sermon. And let me assure you of this. The Bible itself is by definition relevant. There's a phrase that for a long time has bothered me, and that is when someone says we must stand in the pulpit and make the Bible relevant, as if we're relevant and that ancient book is irrelevant, and we've got to drag it into the pulpit, twisting it, trying to make it relevant. No. The way to get at biblical preaching is to believe that by definition, the Bible, the biblical record, is relevant. We may be irrelevant, but it's relevant. It's not that we're in the light and the Bible's in the dark. It's the other way around. The Bible sheds light on our situation in the dark. If you don't think that the Bible's relevant, you could pick up a book like the book by David E. and Diana R. Garland, his late wife, Flawed Families of the Bible. That's an amazing book. In that book, Flawed Families of the Bible, they show that every situation that is faced today in living of these days is found in the Bible when it comes to families. That's just an example among many of how you can combine thenness and nowness. But let me quickly say, in order to preach, you need a plan to preach, or I should be more correctly, a plan to plan. I know some people's view of preaching is to wait until Saturday night and to see if the muse falls on them, scurrying for a text. I've found something over more than a half a century of preaching and preparing to preach. And it's this: the earlier in the week I get started, the more effective I am on Sunday. I've found out if I do something on Monday rather than on Friday or Saturday, it adds depth and texture to my preaching. Neurologists tell us that 7/8 of human consciousness is below the conscious level. It's like an iceberg, 1/8 out of the water, 7/8 under. There's something about letting a text marinate, letting it rest, chewing the cud on it, day in and day out, sleeping on it, that puts things together that will never come together on Saturday night. Now, the way to avoid that Saturday night sermon is to have a plan for planning your preaching. If you've never planned your preaching, then plan 1 quarter. Try it. I think you'll like it. Any plan is better than none. A friend of mine says halitosis is better than no breath at all. Any plan is better than no plan. So try 3 months. If you're off a Sunday, that would be 12 sermons. Get away from the office, get away from the church, get to a quiet place with a Bible and maybe 1 other 2 concordance. Pray and ask God to lead you toward a dozen passages. Now, you're not stuck there. If something national happens that needs to be addressed, of course you can get out of your plan. But you have a basic plan. The late Reverend Dr. Gardner Taylor said it's better to fail with a plan than succeed without one, because you at least know what to do next if you have a plan. Now, you have those passages chosen, some kind of plan, a text and maybe an operating title or a focus statement. That's enough. That way, week by week, you wake up on Monday morning knowing where you're going. Now, alongside what I'm talking about on the Razor's Edge, I want to be talking about a week of getting ready to preach, a system, That system includes on Monday, because you have a plan to preach, having the text and the tools to study the text already before you. You're ready to get ready to preach. That means Monday, you can just read your text. I suggest on Monday that pastors not struggle with deep exegetical study, parsing verbs and declining nouns and looking for root meanings. No, read your text over and over and over. Read it in varied translations. There's two big kinds of translations. There are committee translations, beginning with the Authorized or King James Version, the New King James, the New NRSV, the New American Standard Bible, the ESV. These were all done by committees. They have the safety that many people looked at it, but then also get a short shelf of individual translations. That's where you find some very interesting translations. J.B. Phillips, one of the earliest 20th century modern translation, or C.B. Williams, printed by Moody Press, a great translation for verb tenses, are the message by the late Eugene Peterson, that is really a dynamic equivalent. Get you a group of those and read them. You want all of it in one place, you can buy the volume by Curtis Vaughan, The Bible in 26 translations, where he gives you all of the variants that he thought was significant. Saturate yourself in that text on Monday and take notes. The dullest pencil is better than the sharpest mind. And if you're taking notes, it'll preserve them. You probably won't remember some important things. Now, that's Monday work. You've read the text, but then Tuesday and Wednesday is a time for the analysis of the text. And that analysis of the text is using tools for analysis. But before I say that, let me just say a word about how much text is a text. Sometimes we wrestle with that. Now, sometimes it's clear. If it's a miracle story, it's the whole miracle. You don't stop a sermon in the middle. If it's a parable, it's the whole parable. But sometimes other amounts of text are significant. You can preach a sermon on one rich, robust biblical word, and that is a word like love, our hope, our peace. Those words have scores of pages just on those words in work like Kittle's Theological Dictionary of the New Testament, or the word in Greek, hupomone, which is translated, often under-translated, patience. It means active perseverance. A sermon on that word would visit places where that word is used. Say in the last chapter of Mark, when our Lord says, he who hupomone, who endures to the end, shall be saved. Or James chapter 1, when it says, consider a thing to be joy in your trials, because they build hupomone, they build perseverance. Sermons on words. You want to see how that can work? Get the little book by William Barclay, Works of the Flesh and Fruit of the Spirit, where he gives a little sermon on every one of the words in those lists. Another amount of text is just a phrase, a significant, pregnant, weighty phrase. For example, John 15, when Judas leaves the upper room, we read, Judas went out and it was night. Now, you better believe in John's gospel, he doesn't just mean the sun went down. The gospel that begins in its first chapter, that he was the light, giving light to everyone coming into the world. The gospel who begins that way, is the gospel who picks this statement up. He went out and it was night. In John 8, Jesus says, I myself am the light of the world. We read, when Judas went out, it was night. That's a phrase. And a phrase that's worthy to understand that anytime you go away from the light, you go out into the night. And you develop that, the night of regret, the night of not being able to stop what you started, the night that will cost you everything, and so forth. Now, another amount of text is a verse. That is called a textual sermon, in which the whole basis of the sermon is around a single verse. Now, Charles Haddon Spurgeon was the great exponent and performer of that kind of preaching in his lifetime. A number of the sermons by the great and iconic Reverend Dr. Gardner Taylor were single verse sermons. And that means you take that verse And like a faceted diamond, you hold it up to the light, you turn it around and around, and you refract off of that verse in every way that you can refract. That's a textual sermon. If you want to see it done, look at one of Dr. Taylor's sermons, such as There's a Balm in Gilead, or one of Spurgeon's sermons in which he takes every word in the verse, and that word becomes a movement or a sub-movement in the sermon. It's a textual sermon. For whatever reason, that has somewhat fallen out of favor, but Spurgeon preached 3,700 sermons in 56 volumes, which you can get if you want to, both digitally or in hard copy, on text preaching in the way I've described. Now, the normal amount of text for a biblical expository sermon will be 6, 8, 10 verses, a story, a miracle, a parable, a defined paragraph in Scripture. We'll come back to that because that's what we're going to talk about. But let me also say, in these post-biblical world, days of biblical illiteracy, there's a place for sermons on entire books. For example, if you say to your church, it's like it was in the days of Habakkuk, how many of them do you think that rings a bell? Not many. If you say it's like it was in the time of Nehemiah, they may not have a clue who Nehemiah is. They may think he's a linebacker for the Detroit Lions. There's a place for preaching sermons, one sermon that goes over the mountain peaks and down through the valleys of a single book. If you want to see a good example of that, look at G. Campbell Morgan's book, Messages from the 12 Hebrew Prophets. One sermon each from each of the so-called minor prophets, or the 12. Shows you how to do that. I wouldn't jump in the deep end and do one sermon for Job, but you can start with a sermon from Philemon, 2 John, 3 John, Jude, those single chapter books. If you want to see a masterpiece of a sermon, Philemon, look at YouTube and look at the late Haddon Robinson preaching on, put it on MasterCard. So any amount of text can be a text. You've got it before you. You've read it on Monday. On Tuesday and Wednesday, you're going to turn to the capital V voice of the capital C church. That's what I like to call the exegetical biblical commentaries. Now, the word exegesis, E-X-E-G-E-S-I-S, is shop talk in preaching. Every profession has some inside baseball language. Exago means to lead the meaning out that is in the text. Now, on Monday, you may think you know what a word in the text means, but you may find out Tuesday and Wednesday in reading reverent biblical exegetes, people who lead the meaning out, that you were wrong in what you thought. Now, if that's the case, you need to correct what you thought in all likelihood. I sometimes put it this way. If you find out in your own thinking that a biblical word means something that no one in church history thought it meant, no contemporary scholar, not a David Garland or an F.F. Bruce or an N.T. Wright, no reformer, not Luther or Calvin, no patristic writer, not Augustine of North Africa or Tertullian of North Africa. Nobody in history said that's what that word meant. You're wrong. The Bible is the most studied book in history, and if you decide that a word means something that nobody else ever said it meant, you need to be going back to the drawing table. Spurgeon said one time he was amazed at how much some preachers thought of what God told them and how little they thought of what he told someone else. That's a reason on Tuesday and Wednesday you want to take 3 to 5 exegetical commentaries. Now, there are 3 levels of those. These are not academic terms, they're my terms. There's the heavyweights. Those are the language commentaries that go word by word and phrase by phrase. If you have the use of biblical languages, say it could be the Baker Exegetical, an excellent new set of books on the text, or the Zondervan Exegetical, those are New Testament commentaries. Or you might want to go to the New International Critical, covers the whole Bible, or the Broadman Commentary, or the Word Commentary. These are all heavyweight commentaries. They go word by word. My goal in studying every week is to try to find out what every operative word in the text means. so that I can do an expanded reading of the text by Wednesday. I can look at a word, if it's a place name, human name, if the root meaning of that word means something significant, I can look at it. Now, facts are what you're looking for Tuesday and Wednesday. Some of you are of an age to remember the television detective on Dragnet, Joe Friday. If you remember, one of Joe Friday's famous statements was, in looking at a confused witness, just the facts, ma'am, just the facts. Well, that's what you're looking for Tuesday and Wednesday. You're looking for facts. What do these words mean? You can't tell the congregation accurately what they are to mean now unless you understand what they meant when Jeremiah or Isaiah or Habakkuk or Mark wrote the word. You're looking for that. Now, the mid-level of commentary under the heavyweight, midweight, are those commentaries that treat scripture phrase by phrase. These would be commentaries like the InterVarsity Press or Warren Wiersbe's B series. They collect things. Now, start with the heavyweight and then move to the midweight. Now, lightweight commenting doesn't mean that they're lightweight thinkers. Lightweight commenting are sermons. Sermons that are in print, sermons that you can read, sermons you can find at the Christian bookstore, whether by the classical preachers or contemporary preachers, or sermons you hear in so many ways. Those are really not commentaries. And I ask you to leave those alone until your sermon is written, and then listen to them after you've done your own work. It's not appetizing to offer to a congregation something that someone else has chewed, and then you've tried to chew, and then you give it to the church. Do your own exegetical study. Your own study, first of all, not of sermons and not of sermon outlines, but of the text. Give yourself Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday. I say 2 hours a day, those 3 days somehow. Now, there you've got all this stuff. What do you do with it? Well, in my outline on the razor's edge, backbone, not jellyfish, and the pulpit. How do you give the sermon some structure? Well, you give it, first of all, structure by discovering what Haddon Robinson calls the big idea, what Tom Long calls the focus statement, what earlier generations of preachers call the thesis, even the proposition. Whatever you call it, it's the same thing. It's the ability to state in one sentence, as clear as the moon on a cloudless night, luminous, shining, like a north star, in one sentence, what that sermon is going to be about in a present tense sentence. For example, if you're preaching from that miracle in Mark 8, when Jesus had to try twice for the man to see, remember it? He spat in the man's eyes and said, "What do you see?" And the man said, "I see look like men, trees. I don't know what it is, walking trees or something." Jesus had to touch him a second time. And the big idea would not be in Bethsaida, Jesus had to touch a man twice for him to really see. No, the big idea is in the present tense. You may need the second touch of the Lord to see as he wants you to see. You hear the difference in that? You didn't leave it in Galilee, you brought it into the present tense. Now, to go a little deeper in this, the big idea, that sentence, is always made up of 2 parts. The bigger part is the subject of what you're going to talk about. That's called subject. The complement is what you're going to say about it. The subject, the complement. If I say Jack and Jill, that doesn't mean anything. That's a subject. We don't know anything about Jack and Jill. They could have gone on a cruise, a moon launch, played soccer. No, but I say Jack and Jill went up a hill to fetch a pail of water. That's a subject, Jack and Jill, and a complement, Say in Matthew 20, that remarkable parable about grace, the laborers in the vineyard who came at dawn and noon and 3 and 5. It's about grace. That's the subject. But the complement is God's grace is so good that sometimes it is outrageous. Those that came in at the 11th hour got 100% of his grace. Learn how to construct big ideas. raise them up, write them out, and then throw them away until you get to just the one that you actually want to use. Now, you have that big idea. Where are you going to put it in the sermon? At the beginning of the sermon or at the end? That determines, in a sense, what's going to give movement to your sermon, what will make the sermon flow. Now, historically, we've called those things outlines, headings, divisions, points. I like to call them movements because that's what you want them to do. Move the sermon through the text. So here you have Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, gathered all of these facts. You have a big idea. This is where I want you to keep in mind the sermon tree. Think of a tree, a beautiful tree that is rooted in the soil, has a sturdy trunk, but it grows out into multiple branches at the top. I owe this to H. Grady Davis in his famous book, Design for Preaching. The sermon tree roots in the soil of the text. That's your exegetical work. The steady trunk is the big idea. But the right kind of big idea is expandable. It's germinative. It will break out into several movements. And those become, if you were, the divisions of your sermon that help you and the congregation remember it. Now, that is not always necessarily three. Now, there's some reasons why most sermons have been 3 points. The great Samuel DeWitt Proctor talked about preaching as thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. And indeed, many texts work that way. But sometimes a sermon might be 1 big point, or 2, or even 4. Say a text like 1 Peter 2. Blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who, according to his great mercy, has given us new birth into a living hope, into inheritance kept in heaven for you. There you've got 4 movements about the new birth. It's according to his mercy, it's into a living hope, it's into an inheritance, and that inheritance is kept for you. That's 4 things. Let the text naturally show you how many movements are in the text. The commentators can help you with that. Now, most of us, I'm persuaded most of the time, preach what is called deductive sermons. That is, somewhere in the introduction, we state the big idea, and then we break it into pieces in the sermon. Most preaching that I've studied in the English-speaking world, in fact, in my book on global Baptist preaching, most Baptist preaching in the world is deductive. You, in the old sense, tell them what you're going to tell them. Sometimes the title states it, sometimes it's in the introduction, and you take that into little pieces. That's deductive thinking. That is, if I walk into a room and see a table, I just say that's a table. If I thought deductively, I would say, therefore, it's a rectangle, it has a surface, and it has 4 legs. The deduction is that's a table. That's made up of those pieces. That's what you do when you preach a deductive sermon. You say, this is God's table. Let's look at the surface of it. It's a rectangle, a square, a circle. Let's look at the legs. They're 3 or 4, so forth. That's what, now, inductive thinking is the other way. Inductive thinking looks at the particulars first, and then at the end, states the big idea. If you're interested in that kind of preaching, the famous homiletic name related to it in our lifetime is Fred Cranach, inductive preaching. And that is, give them a particular, and at the end, when the big idea comes about, the congregation doesn't know whether you said it or whether they thought it. That is induction. For example, I have an inductive sermon about that famous leper healing right after the Sermon on the Mount. When a man ran up to Jesus, Luke says, full of leprosy. His fingers were falling off, his digits were falling off, his nose, his appendages, full of leprosy. All the Old Testament, only 2 people were ever cured by leprosy, and that was the act of God. Remember, he came up and fell down. He didn't care what people thought about him, fell down in front of Jesus, begging him, Lord, if you're willing, you'll heal me. It was an act of intensity and urgency. It was a misunderstanding of Jesus because he thought Jesus wasn't willing. So in my sermon on that, I began talking about different kinds of touches, professional touches where a doctor touches, athletic touches where you push back on the lineman in front of you. So just to get them thinking about different kinds of touches. And then I take one piece of that each. I say that the man ran and fell in front of Jesus. He lost all concern about what people thought about him. And I talk about times in my own life when I didn't care what anybody thought about me when I came to the Lord. Where I talk about his urgency, asking over and over. And I talk about instances where people ask over and over. I talk about his misunderstanding of Jesus when he said, Lord, if you're willing, you can heal me. He thought Jesus had the power, but not the goodness. And I think about those who believe Jesus can do something everybody would think. But I save the big idea to the end. When Jesus touched the man, there was an audible gasp. You know what an audible gasp moment is? An audible gasp is when a high wire worker falls off the wire. A child falls into the lion pit at the zoo, or a little running back is hit on Friday night under the lights on the football gridiron, doesn't even move. Everybody goes, But when Jesus touched that leper, there was an audible gasp. You didn't touch lepers. You got leprosy if you did that. And then the big idea. What they didn't know is that Jesus is always more contagious than anything he touches. Now, I had taken them toward that, but like springing a trap, I waited until the very end of that. Deduction and induction. Big book about deduction, Haddon Robinson, Biblical Preaching. Big book about induction would be a book like Fred Craddock's book. To me, deduction is painting by numbers, and that is you can fill in the lines more easily. Induction is more like painting a masterpiece and hanging it on the wall of the art museum. You can listen to these and others who try this kind of preaching. Now, another way of preaching, very popular today, is narrative, and that is simply telling a story. Some great preachers we know are narrators. Reverend Dr. Ralph Douglas West Sr., Reverend Dr. Maurice Watson, or younger preacher, Reverend Dr. Charlie Dates, among others, are often narrative. Now, narrative is a story. You know that a Bible passage is a narrative if it's a story. That is, there's a story and a storyteller. The historical books are narratives. The parables are narratives. Acts is mostly a narrative. The epistles are by and large not narrative. Now, when you're preaching a narrative sermon, you want to still find the big idea, but you may drop it anywhere in the sermon. If you're preaching a narrative sermon on the parable of the man who needed bigger barns and lost his soul, you might want to say somewhere in the middle of the sermon, pause, look at the church long enough that they look up to see what happened to you, and say, greed is wanting more and more of what you already have enough of. You've made a principle out of that whole narrative. Now, Walter Kaiser talks about principalizing. That is, take a chunk of a story and extract from that a principle. If you're dealing with the life of Joseph when he's a young man and his brothers sell him to the Arab slave traders who take him to Egypt, you get your arm around all that story and you coin something that's true then, now, and always. And that is, sometimes we don't know how we got into the mess we're in. See, Joseph did some things to himself. He was a snitch, and he told people his dreams that weren't ready to hear them. That was unwise, but there were some things done to him. Sometimes we don't know how we got in the mess we're in. That gets your arms around the whole thing. Or the Potiphar's wife episode, whole chapter where Miss Potiphar chases him around the house. Put your arms around that and get a principle to organize it. Say, sometimes, even when we do what is right, it turns out wrong. Joseph ran away from his Potiphar, but he went to jail. You get the point. Narrative preaching. Now, how do you know you have a narrative? Well, there's a story and a storyteller, but not only is a story and storyteller, there is also moves through time. There was a then and a now. There's development in time, and there's moved from cause to effect. If I say the king and queen died, that's just a statement, not a narrative. But if I say the king died of a stroke and the queen died of a broken heart, that's a narrative. It's a little story that goes through time, cause, and effect. Think about narrative preaching. There are a lot of books on it. You can find any one of many, or listen to the great narrative preachers, some of whom I name. Now, there are other ways to organize sermon movements. A multiple text sermon is a sermon that may draw on more than one text. Campbell Morgan's book, Jesus' Answer to Job's Question. Job asks a question: if a man die, shall he live again? Jesus' answer: I am the resurrection and the life. Or on burden bearing. End of Galatians, chapter 6 says, let each man bear his own burden. Then it says, bear one another's burdens. Well, that's a lot of burden. You go then to 1 Peter, you read that wonderful verse, cast your burden on the Lord. Now, that can be legitimately used as a multiple text sermon. There are many other forms, but those are some that we might mention. So, the two big things that categorize any sermon is, does it have unity and does it have movement? Does it have unity? When the church sits there and asks, what in the world is this about? The sermon doesn't have unity. Your sermon begins leaving the garden with Adam and Eve, walks out of Egypt in the Exodus, conquers the land with Joshua, sings Psalm 23 with David, and somehow winds up with John on the island of Patmos. That sermon didn't have any unity. If the church asks, what is this about? You don't have a big idea. On the other hand, a sermon may not have movement. When the church sits and says, where in the world is this going? You're marching in place, or they don't understand where it's going. Unity and movement need to characterize every biblical sermon. But is that all? No. You move beyond this to those things that enrich a sermon. Because in every movement of every biblical sermon, you need to do three things. If there's three movements, you do three things times three. If there's two movements, 2 times times 3. And you know this, if you've studied basic homiletics, you need to explain what the church does not know about the text. Now, don't explain the obvious. Jesus is on the Sea of Galilee. Don't say it was a sea and there was water in it. There was water everywhere. Wherever you look, there was water. That's not exposition. That's just telling them what they know. If you tell them, really, the Sea of Galilee is an inland lake, about 7 by 13 miles, and it's below sea level, surrounded by mountains, then you told them something they probably don't know about the Sea of Galilee. Explain what they don't know about the text, and also explain it in language that is not overly complicated. That is, you're taking your study, which will have some technical words in it, and you want to land that in the lap of the middle school student, the mother of the church, and even that person who wandered in who doesn't have a clue what is going on. Fosdick, the famous 1920s liberal preacher, said, few people come to church wanting to know the latest thing that happened to the Jebusites. And that's true. You need to say why that's significant for today, God's people, and so forth. Explain the text. Now, I have found in the current climate that most congregations can only take 2 or 3 minutes of close ordered exposition about a point. By that, I mean this. You're looking at the text with it. Notice that his name is Nehemiah. Notice that Artaxerxes sent him. Notice why the walls were torn down in Jerusalem. Notice this and notice that, explaining the text. Now, I preached long enough when I remember people could take, 5, 6, 7 minutes of that. But in this texting, tweeting world, Your explanation of the text needs to be vivid. It needs to be visual. It needs to be sensual. How did this smell, taste, look, sound, feel? And it needs to be dramatic, if you would, in order to engage people in the explanation of the text. You say, well, I don't want to do that. I want to keep them in the text for 30 minutes. Well, that's fine. You may get that out of the mouth, but you're going to have a hard time getting into their ear. It's not just you saying, it is that congregation hearing it. And in today's texting, tweeting world, you may be throwing frisbees over the head of the congregation. They look and say, wow, Rev must have been to seminary. We don't understand a thing he's saying. But if that homiletical frisbee doesn't land in someone's lap, you've only made a speech to yourself. Consider how to popularize the language of the text so the people sitting right there hear it. Now, one of the tricks of that trade is to use contemporary language about past events. Now, don't go over the top, not every word, but after the contest with the prophets of Baal, when Elijah beat everybody back to Jezreel, it was a miracle. Or you might say, Elijah got in his Maserati and outdrove everybody. Now, 1 out of 50 people will come to the door and say, Pastor, I didn't know they had cars back then. Just say, bless your heart. Everybody else knew you were contemporizing what was said. Or, like Robinson does in his sermon on the man with bigger barns, talk about that man after dinner sitting down at his desk in his wooden wainscoted study and looking at the blueprints for the barns. You can use contemporary language to help move that out of thenness and the nowness, but not too much. You don't want it to be cute. Now, this brings us to Thursday. You've been collecting expository material. Next session, we'll talk about illustrative material. It's time to write the sermon. And when we meet in the next session, we're going to talk about how to do that and how to add to that sermon contemporary illustrative material and pointed application that get that sermon heard in your context. But first, I'm going to pause for about 15 minutes of your question and answer. So let's be ready. I look forward to receiving your questions. I'm here at George Truett Seminary with some colleagues. They are engaged not only in this seminar, but in learning, teaching, preaching. So they're going to be overhearing your question and answer. So I give you greetings from Waco, Texas, where it's probably warmer than around Albany, New York, and from Baylor University. I just have to say this, the home of the national champion Baylor basketball team. That has nothing to do with this, but I just wanted to say it. All right, gentlemen, if you just want to ask your questions, I believe we can hear you. I'll be happy to respond to questions on the basis of the first 15 minutes of this, first 45 minutes.
Let me just share that in the chat is a copy of his PowerPoint presentation. So if you haven't seen that, you can go in there and download that as we go through the second part, if you haven't already seen that.
Yes, sir. Good morning. I'll break the ice and try something. How are you doing?
Ed, what is your name?
Ed Williamson, Bethel Baptist, White Plains, New York, Vice
White
Moderator.
Plains. Good to hear from you, brother.
All right. Yes, just you were talking Thursday. You came into Thursday. It sounds like you were talking about structure. Thursday is a day of putting structure into the into your plan of preparation. Okay, and so that's going to be more shaping the sermon and how it comes out. And the last part you were saying as you close was making it contemporary. So could you elaborate on that a little bit?
Yeah, thank you. Well, in the little chronology of weekly preparation that I gave to you, I see Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, reverentially as fact-finding, your own reading of the text, and exegetical reading. But I found in my own life, and this is right out of my own pastoral life, that I needed the curtain to fall on Wednesday in terms of studying the text. I would always, had this was my failure and temptation, I wanted to read one more exegetical commentary rather than face the terror of a blank page of paper. So I had to let the curtain fall on Wednesday. My idea about Thursday is you've got all this exegetical stuff, and the sermon is like the earth in Genesis 1, I like to say. It's without form and void. Now, I hope that across those 3 days, subjects and complements, what you're going to talk about and what you're going to say about it, and the focus statement of the big idea, that's playing in your mind. It ought to be coming to you. These things cannot be hermetically sealed. It's coming to you. You're making marginal notes. But for discipline's sake, I say on Thursday, you're going to discover that, nail it down, rivet it to your own location's reality. And then, as I said, let the branches grow out of that trunk. Remember my idea of the sermon tree, rooted in the text. The trunk is the big idea. You're discovering those, they seminally germinate from that big idea. And then you start writing. Now, I said this, I can't remember which of the 2 lectures, maybe in the second one you're about to hear. I urge you to speak it out before you write it out. Preaching is an oral discipline. And I have never been ready to preach until I'm ready to get up and walk around my study and start to put it in oral form several times. And what I write down is that oral form rather than the other way. That's why sermons sound like essays sometimes as manuscripts. So Thursday, I'm nailing down the big idea, the focus statement. I'm articulating the movements, I like to use that word, and I'm starting to write. And then Friday, I'm refining that more. Does that get at it somewhat, Brother Edmund?
Yes, sir. That's fine. Thank you.
Daniel Blackburn, we spoke on the phone over the weekend. I helped you with the recording. I normally have not scheduled preaching more than maybe a 4 or 6 week series. How much time should I dedicate to planning out? You said start with a quarter. How much time should I dedicate to doing that in planning?
Well, thank you. It's a very good question, Jack. And let me commend you for planning, period, however many weeks. I sometimes say halitosis is better than no breath at all. And having some plan is better than no plan. And I could wish you are the exception rather the rule. Let me assure you, even in planning 4 to 6 weeks in all my experience. Here's what I say about quarterly planning. I would suggest, try to be my practice, that a month before the quarter begins, if it's quarter 4, October, November, December, okay, which is coming up, September 1 or thereabouts, a rock-ribbed appointment with yourself, as if you had been subpoenaed, a rock-ribbed appointment, because preaching is so easy to get overrun by the secondary and the tertiary. Get away from the church. I could never do it, and it's just out of my practice, anywhere close to the church office. Get away in the forest. I don't care where. with a Bible, with a calendar, maybe with a concordance, nothing more than that. Think through and pray through, say Q4, all right? Now, your church may or may not say anything about Labor Day, whatever, you know. But certainly in Q4, you've got coming up Thanksgiving, you've got coming up the first Sunday of Advent, all right? And in your own community and context, there may be things you're going to note by the calendar. I mean, that's the contextual axis, okay? And then you may have things you're noting in community, society, and church that need to be addressed in that quarter, all right? You're noting all of that. And that informs the planning of preaching. And then just take the calendar and seek to fill in the calendar with all of those things. It's not a rushed day. And let me say this, it is not an unapproachable day when it comes to change. I'm often asked, well, what if something happens? Or what if the Lord tells me to preach on something else? I'm like Nike, just do it. I mean, if you say the Lord tells you, we'll do it. But as Gardner Taylor said, Dr. Gardner Taylor, it's better to fail with a plan than succeed without one. Because if things don't work next Sunday, you know where to go back. Does that help at all? Yeah.
Yes, it does. Yes, it does. Now, do you do more series preaching, or is it maybe one-off sermons, for lack of a better phrase?
Well, series preaching, in my experience, and I talk with practicing preachers all the time, say like Reverend Dr. Ralph Douglas West Sr., who plans along the way we're talking, 3 months at a time. I don't think, Dr. West doesn't think, and others I talk with, that the typical church can stand more than 6 Sundays in a row for a series, just in terms of attentiveness. I'm not even sure it's that much. In the late 70s, when I was a pastor, I would take a year preaching through Mark. This is how much things have changed, okay, in 40 years. A year preaching through Mark, 36 sermons through Ephesians, and keep a growing congregation. I think that's well nigh impossible now. The in and out attendance of church, the lack of people's ability to keep up with exhaustive exposition. As I said, I used to worry about how would I get it out of my mouth. My worry now is how do I get it into the listener's ears? So I think, Daniel, to me, to answer your question, 6 is a limit. That's going to vary from place to place. You know, preachers also build over years their own kind of congregation. If you're committed to preaching 2 years through John or something, and then 2 years through Isaiah, whatever, if you're there for a long time, you'll build that kind of congregation. Say one of the preachers I admire very much, Alistair Begg in Cleveland, is going through Samuel now in a slow, almost exhaustive way to thousands of people. But Alistair's been nearly 40 years. And people in Cleveland who want that kind of preaching show up, if that makes any sense.
Yes.
So, and there are those, and I think Alistair would say this, you need to train your people how to listen. Well, that's true to a point. But for most of us, most of the time, who are not Alistair Beggs, I think 6 may be the limit.
Thank you.
After Alistair talk, he could read the phone book.
Right.
All right, somebody else.
Dr. Gregory Damone Johnson. How are you, sir?
Bone, how are you, friend?
Doing well, doing well.
Yes.
Wanted to ask you how you navigated through pastoral duties and administration, visitation, and then crafting out or prioritizing study, because I found that a lot of times your, pastoral duties creep in on study time. And then how, I guess a follow-up to that is, how do you convey that to the congregation?
Well, I'm glad they creep in for you. Sometimes they hit me like a Texas tornado. I could give you any number of examples. Sitting down and trying to study, and the boiler blew up at Travis Avenue Baptist Church and nearly took the janitor into eternity. Sitting down and trying to study, and my new church dietitian, who came from California, tried to make my old church cooks cook quiche. And they got into a pan throwing fight in the church kitchen, and my new dietitian hid in the walk-in refrigerator. Those are interruptions. Those did not leave me in a pious frame of mind all the rest of the day. Those were just some. No week is ideal. And my Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday is putting an ideal up here so that the next day you have something to which to return. I do think you need something to which to return in the disruptions, okay? Now, here is my other suggestion. Always keep something with you to study wherever you are in the pastorate. I spent a lot of time in hospitals, in small churches, middle-sized churches, and 2 mega churches. Waiting with families. Just when I think about interruption, I think about getting called to the hospital. I always had something with me, deliberately. Usually a book, or I had copied Xerox then, some exegetical material. I'd carry it with me. I would sit with a family, meet with a family, pray with a family, wait with a family, but look over to them sincerely and say, would you mind, while we're waiting here, if I were to study the Bible a minute? Nobody ever said, oh, preacher, don't study the Bible. And I'm not being trite, it's what I did. And they were fine. I had a ministry of presence. I'd talked, I'd prayed. I think about things waiting with families for some word to come out of the operating room. I can't even count the number of times over nearly 30 years in the pastorate I did that. Always have something with you to study. You are in enough waiting situations. I don't care where it is, in your car, in lobbies, anywhere, that if you know where you're going that week and you have materials, you can buy time, okay? So I'd say 2 things. Always have something with you to grab odd times. And when a whole day is blown away, go back to the plan, okay? The next day. Does that get added a bit?
Yes, sir. Thank you. Thank you for that.
Well, all right, gentlemen, I know there's another 45 minutes of me for you to listen to, so let's pull back into that. And then at the next break time, I personally will take, as much time as we can. So, once again, it's a joy to be with you in this session, sponsored by your association, my dear friend, your moderator, Reverend Dr. Damone Johnson, those of you in the Hudson River Valley. In the first session, we were looking at standing on the razor's edge, and we reviewed Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday of study, and how to do biblical exposition, how to shape a sermon with unity And that is what it's about, and movement, that is where it's going. But in order to get a sermon not only out of your mouth, but also into other person's ears in the pew, it takes more than just that. When you sit down on Thursday, in the plan I'm suggesting, to begin writing the sermon manuscript, you're going to need more than exposition. The great preachers of the ages agree that you need to bring some lived experience into the moment of preaching. What I mean by lived experience is what sometimes is called illustration, and that is pieces of life today that fit well to shed light on your explanation of the text. So I want to take some time to talk about illustrating. You can find exegetical works easily enough. There are literally today hundreds of expository exegetical volumes, word by word, on every book in Holy Scripture. But illustrating is something else. Illustrating needs to have your DNA on it, your personality on it, who you are stamped on it. That is, people can anticipate the kind of stories that you might tell that really come from your own experience. Now, let me begin this by talking about some reasons for sermon illustrations. Why not just give people Bible, 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 rather than tell narrative, illustrative anecdotes? That's a good question. There are some profoundly influential, nationally known preachers who say that you ought to use only the Bible to illustrate the Bible. For example, if I'm talking about the healing of a leper in the New Testament, I ought to compare that with the healing of a leper, say, by Elisha in the Old Testament. Why bring in contemporary culture as an illustration? Well, if there ever was a time that it's needed, I believe it's now. Perhaps it was in another century that you could make a reference. It's like it was in the days of Nehemiah. And everybody out in the pews saw that as an illustration because they knew how it was in the days of Nehemiah. I don't think I need to tell you that those days are long gone. Dan Bauman cites in his introduction to preaching a poll that was taken on the very steps of a Bible-believing, Jesus-following church that asked people to name as many apostles as they could. The average church member could name 3. Now, these are not pagans, secularists. These are people coming out of a Bible kind of church, could name 3 apostles. Then some of them started making up names like the Apostle Bob or the Apostle Jim. Just when people don't know the names of the apostles, you're not going to be able to refer to Zephaniah or Zechariah as illustrative material. People need contemporary stories. And there's another reason for this, and that is people's inability to pay attention to close-ordered exposition. The tweeting, texting world can only attend so long to your exposition of the Word of God. Now, I know there are preachers who say you need to bring them up, and there's some truth in that. You do need to challenge the congregation, but also you need to get your sermons heard. It's interesting when you look at a congregation listening to biblical preaching. You're talking about the words of a great text. There's now, therefore, no condemnation to those who are in Christ Jesus, who walk after the Spirit, etc. You're dealing word by word, explaining those great words from Romans 8. After 3 or 4 minutes, you'll notice that the people's eyes start going back in their head like the wheels in a slot machine. They just check out. They don't attend that long. You've got to bring in a story about what it means that there is no condemnation. Now, what about that? Well, it helps relax the congregation so that they can come back in a few minutes to your close-ordered exposition. That's one of the reasons. But also a reason is stories help make truth memorable. Now, you may bring the congregation your insight from the root meaning of a Greek or Hebrew word, and that is informing them. Faith comes by hearing, and hearing not by the word of God. They need the word. God has chosen to attach salvation to hearing the word. But what they're going to remember, and you know this, is the good story you're told 2 or 3 weeks from now. Stories help attach the truth to the memory of the congregation. We ought to tell stories again because a good deal of Jesus' preaching was telling stories. The parables are narrative anecdotes. They are illustrative. Now, we have Jesus' didactic propositional teaching, yes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. Blessed are the meek. Blessed. That's didactic propositional statements. And he said that. But he also used illustrative material to make what he said memorable. And he could have only said, the lawyer, your neighbor, is that person who's right under your nose right now who needs your help. But he didn't say that. He told the parable of the Good Samaritan. You know what I mean. Jesus told stories. Now, let's talk about the qualities of stories that are helpful in preaching. What ought to be the nature of those stories? Well, one thing is they need to be credible. That is, they need to be believable. One of the problems with sermon stories over the generations has been some of them go over the border into the incredible. Much of my preaching life, I've heard this story. It's World War I. They're in France. The British boys are on one side and the Germans on the other. There's no man's land in between. There's a field telephone that goes back to British headquarters. A bombshell has broken the line, so the message can't get through. One of the British boys jumps out of the trenches, strafed with fire, takes a hold of the two ends of the line, and the telephone message gets through him, even though the electrical charge killed him. And then the preacher typically says, that's the way Calvary is. Jesus took God's hand and your hand, and the message got through. Well, the latter part of that's true, but the illustration's fake. It's phony. It's incredible. It never happened. We need to understand when we're telling stories, particularly in today's world where people have devices in their laps where they can check the credibility of almost anything, that incredible stories don't help. Even a kid sitting out in the fourth pew recognizes that there's not enough power in a phone line to kill somebody and that the message is going to go through your body. I use that as a weird and extreme example, but you know what I'm talking about. Preacher stories that are incredible. Remember, people can check. I was recently using a story about Theodore Roosevelt, and I numbered him wrong. As 23rd President of the United States. Someone met me at the door with their iPhone and said, notice, now he wasn't 23rd. People are listening, and they're able to track the incredible sounding thing more quickly than ever they are. Now, what makes stories in your sermons credible? Well, what makes them is detail. And that is, if they are a story of detail, it lends to their credibility. Let me give you an example about this. Speaking of Teddy Roosevelt, you could say Teddy Roosevelt, everybody knows, had a tough time as a little boy. Teddy Roosevelt had some challenges, but he outgrew them and became a strong leader. Well, that's okay. A lot of people know that about TR. If you want to tell a story about TR, tell it like this. In fact, this has to do with Albany. At 25 years old, he was the youngest assemblyman in the New York State Assembly. He was on the floor in Albany, waiting the birth of his first baby, his wife, Alice. Telegram came, baby was born, passed out cigars on the floor at Albany and headed for the train station. Then another telegram boy hit him on the way to the train station. Come quickly, things are not going well. Well, fear gripped his heart. 5-hour train ride then, Grand Central Station, down to East 20th Street, a brownstone, up the stairs. His brother Elliot met him and said, Theodore, there's a curse on this house. Alice is dying downstairs and our mother upstairs. On the same day, Valentine's Day, 1884, Valentine's Day, he lost his wife and his mother in the same house. Harvard University has his diary. He wrote in it, "The lights have gone out in my life forever." But they really hadn't. He hadn't even started to become the person that TR would become in American history. Went out west, made himself a cowboy, came back, police commissioner in New York, undersecretary of the Navy, civil service commissioner, vice president, up San Juan Hill, president. Now he belongs to the ages when he thought the lights were going out. Now, that is a detailed story. I would rather hear you use one good detailed story in a sermon than 3 or 4 generalized ambiguous stories where if you were to fall over, the congregation could tell the rest of the story. But there's another quality of stories that is very important, and that is that the story does not run away with the sermon. I think we've all heard stories so dramatic, so engaging, so personal, so hot, that they wash over the sermon and people forget what the sermon is about. I like to put it this way: stories are not Tiffany lamps, they are streetlights. Now, when someone has a Tiffany lamp, they don't use that Tiffany lamp to read. The lamp is extremely valuable, made out of colored glass in the lamp works of Tiffany in New York, and they cost tens of thousands of dollars. I don't have one. You look at them, they draw attention to themselves as a lamp. Now, a street light is not that way. A street light shows you the way. I walk at night, I can't ever remember pausing to say, wow, what a street light. Street light is there, it's in the background, but it shows the way. Now that is what we need in sermon illustrations, that street light quality. Now, another thing, the story needs to fit the image or the concept in that movement of that sermon. Stories either have a sticky quality to stick to an image in your text. Woman at the well, the image is water. Psalm 46, God is a refuge. He's a castle like a refuge. The stories need to stick to that image. You need a refuge story in Psalm 46 or a water story in John chapter 4. If it's 1 John 1, God is light, you need a story about the qualities of light. Or it may be a concept, and the story needs to illustrate not an image, but that concept. Take in the parable of the talents, 5 and 2 and 1, and how you use your talents. The concept there is risk, and you want to tell a story about risk, whether it's alpine mountain climbing or shooting the rapids on the Colorado River. Plenty of stories that illustrate risk. So when you're brooding over, ruminating over, reflecting on the words, phrases, and clauses of your text prayerfully, ask yourself, is there an image here? Water, rock, throne, whatever. Or is there a concept here? Perseverance, doubt, grief, hope. And the story needs to stick to the image or the concept. Now, here's another thing about telling stories. Make sure that they are at least understandable to the congregation you're preaching to. Now, what do I mean by that? Sometimes stories can be so complicated that the preacher has to stop and give a sermon or sermonette about the story. Stories need to have a self-evidential quality. In that regard, good sermon stories are like jokes. If you tell a joke, it needs to work. All of us who've ever told jokes publicly know that if the joke doesn't work on the surface, you don't want to stop and explain the joke. The joke has to be funny on the surface or it doesn't work. Now, sermon stories are that way. The typical congregant in your place needs to grasp that story. Now, that doesn't mean you need to dumb down the gospel to the lowest level of anybody, but it means a typical person in the pew needs to understand whether it's a historic story, an allusion to a writer or an author or a work or a movie or a song. Now, here's another thing about the qualities of stories. There needs to be something in a sermon story that appeals to every generation in the congregation. Now, this is where it gets a little tricky. Movie stars that great grandma loved are no longer around. The latest lyrics to a rap song may not mean anything to great grandma. So there you've got generations to span. Now, let me give you a clue. In my own preaching experience, the stories with the widest range of ages, get this, are living thing stories, animal stories, pet stories, stories about flowers and plants and things that happen in nature. Those have a wide range. Popular music, movies, books, historical allusions, they have a narrow range. That's not that you don't use them, but just remember that a sermon needs to be a grab bag of stories for different people. That is, oldest people in your congregation may still be moved about stories about Pearl Harbor, whereas that is ancient history, if it even matters or is familiar to the youngest people in the congregation. Historic stories have to be contextualized if you're going to tell them. For example, if you're going to tell a story about Pearl Harbor, don't talk about the Arizona that sunk, talk about Bob Jones, who was on that ship that day, his home in Kansas, the parents that he left behind. Put a personal face on it, whether it's a big event like that or someone in one of the Twin Towers on 9/11. If you can personalize the story, an individual that participated in one of those great events, the congregation can identify with it even more. Now, those are some of the qualities of sermon illustrations. But let's turn with that to sources for it. If I'm asked one thing more often about my own preaching than anything else, it's where do you find stories? Well, I want to give you some suggestions about finding them. First of all, the very worst place to find sermon stories, the worst place is books that are called 1,000 Sermon Stories. Generally, those books have copied other people who've copied other people, and a lot of those stories started in the 19th century in Victorian England. Just forget books of topical sermon stories. There's no reason for that, and many of them do not sound like you. A late friend of mine, Frank Cook, listened to sermons from students at Spurgeon's College a few decades ago. And one of the young British preachers got up and began his sermon by saying, "When I was the Bishop of Ely," he had stolen a story from an Anglican bishop and didn't even know not to say, "When I was the Bishop of Ely." You don't have to steal them. There are too many around. What do I mean by that? Well, first of all, in all of your reading, keep a pencil in hand, pen. Remember, dullest pencil's better than the sharpest mind. Everything that comes under your nose has the capacity of being a topic for a sermon illustrations. Bus bench backs, bumper stickers, billboards, advertisements, newspapers, magazines, radio, television, movies, and now forever and ever stuff posted on the internet, whether it's Facebook or some other social media. All of those are filled with topical material that is arresting if you visit a museum, whether it's art or whether it's archaeology, same thing. Just a few weeks ago, I was in the British Museum in London in an exhibit about Nero, the emperor who executed the Apostle Paul. He only lived to be 30 years of age. They had uncovered a stone 2,000 years old that paid tribute to his servant whose name was Epaphroditus. Epaphroditus helped Nero end his life and was loyal to the very end. Now, that's not the Epaphroditus of Scripture, but that's the illustration. There was another Epaphroditus. That Epaphroditus carried the offering from Philippi to Paul in Rome. That Epaphroditus carried back the letter of Philippians to Paul. One Epaphroditus helped a bad man die. Another Epaphroditus helped a good man live. One of them got his name on a rock in the British Museum. Another got his name in the New Testament forever and ever. Which Epaphroditus would you rather be? And that's just an observation on the wall at a museum. Ask yourself, and here's the question. You can do it. It really is just like Nike. Just do it. Every time you read something, ask, what concept or image does this speak to? You can't read a sports story, a page in a history book. You can't watch a program without topicalizing. What is this about? Marriage, family, childhood, loss, grief, success, doubt, faith. What is it about? Tag it with a word. The late Fred Craddock was driving somewhere, I think down in the South, and he said he saw a pickup with a bumper sticker on it. And that bumper sticker on the pickup said, I love Jesus and I love my wife. The rest of you can go to hell. Now, some of us would just looked at that and left. That became the beginning illustration for a sermon about our care and our concern, our prayer life. How many of us are willing just to say, I got mine and my family has its, and that's as big as our world ever gets? Bumper sticker. You see all kind of bumper sticker theology. I remember when people had bumper stickers that said, if you love Jesus, honk. Someone made one up. No, if you love Jesus, tithe. Any goose can honk. Yeah, it doesn't take much just to pay attention. Charles Spurgeon told his students one time that he could preach a solid month on every illustration coming from something about a candle burning to illustrate every one of a dozen sermons. Students didn't believe it, so he did it, wrote a little book, Sermons and Candles. And everything about it's about a candle holder, how a candle burns. If you want to see the power of observation, look at that. But you may come to Wednesday, Thursday, or Friday writing your sermon and you still don't have a story. The Lord has given this generation of preachers a gift that no other generation of preachers has ever had. And that is the search engine on the internet. If you have a concept or you have an image, all you have to do is take that to Google or another search engine, and you will be flooded with stories about that image. Say it talks about the throne of God. Put in the word unusual thrones in the Google, and boom, it will explode with the stories of unusual thrones to compare to God's throne. If your image is refuge from Psalm 46, write in impregnable refuge, refuge that cannot be entered. Boom, you'll have more refuge stories than you can imagine. If you haven't been doing this, try it. Take a concept or an image from your text and put it into a search engine, and you'll be flooded with more stories than you can use. So I've talked about two kinds of stories. One of the kinds of stories are the stories you find from your own reading and watching. You discover it. In many senses, the story finds you instead of you finding the story. It's just there. The other is you're stuck. You can't find anything. Then you can go to the search engine and you can find more stories than there. Now, let me give you a word of warning. Don't use anybody else's story and act as if it's yours. There are even recent public ministerial horror stories about that. There's a simple way to solve that. If it happened to somebody else, just say so. You know, Reverend Brown down the road had this unusual experience. Avoid all temptation to say that was your unusual experience all the time now, because of the internet, people are being outed for that kind of plagiarism, sometimes in very public sorts of ways. Make the story your story. Now, let me say a word about using personal stories. That is, stories about you, your life, your family, your home, and your children. I urge preachers not to use more than one of those per sermon, if even that. The gospel is not the gospel according to you. Now, you can use personal stories, but one thing, nobody's life is big enough to illustrate everything. So I ask my students at Truett at Baylor University, limit stories about you, your life, and your experience to one per sermon so you can grow. Really, congregations after a while get to be a bit allergic to constant stories about the preacher and his life. Now, let me give you a clue here. If you do tell a personal story, don't make yourself the hero of every story. Let your stories be confessional in a sense they reveal some things about you. They reveal that you have struggles. You have an Achilles heel. You have a chink in your armor. Now, wait a minute. I don't mean by that, say to the congregation, you know, church Friday night, I got drunk and knocked off a convenience store. No, not that. No. You don't want to wash your dirty law, but stories that reveal you have to deal with your own ineptitude, your own flaws that reveal your humanity rather than your divinity. I really, really do tire of these stories about preachers who always stand to say, my marriage and my parents and my grandparents was greater than anybody's. My kids are better than anybody. My dog. People who know them often know the truth rather than that story. So take care when you tell personal stories that they reveal something about your own humanity, your own weakness. You know, for example, when I use the word Pharisee, nobody in the church wants to say, I'm a Pharisee. Preachers don't want to be Pharisees, but I make the statement when I use that word Pharisee, that I'm a Pharisee. Oh, I'm a bad man. Let me tell you where I'm a Pharisee. And that line at the grocery store that says 15 items or less. I'm standing in that line and I start to count other people's items in front of me. That woman has 18 things. Doesn't she know I've got to get out of here and write a sermon about Jesus? That's the Pharisee mentality. Counting, keeping score. I'm a Pharisee at the grocery store checkout counter. Now that presents me wrestling with a ridiculous issue myself. Don't make yourself the hero of every story. Now, let me give you a few pointers and pitfalls about storytelling. One is only use one, because one good one is enough. In any movement of a story, don't use two different stories. There's too many sermons out there in the future. Don't use them up. One per movement, one and done. Secondly, if you have any doubt about this story, that it may not fit, it may not be appropriate, when in doubt, leave it out. Your doubts about a story are almost always right. When I write a paper and have an excellent proofer read it, almost everything the proofer points out, you should have left that out. I had a doubt about it to begin with. And the truth about stories is that way as well. When in doubt, leave that story out and find one that really works. Now, as I said before, another pointer is have something for everybody in most sermons by the generations in your church. Many of you have 3, some 4, maybe even some 5 generations. Reach out and find things that relate to different people in that story. Now, I need to move on, but those are a few things about sermon illustrations. But that's not the only thing you need to do in addition to explaining the Bible. You also need to let it land in life, and that is find a landing place for that sermon in life. Where does it fit in life? That's called application. Now, application is, first of all, a theological necessity because it happens in the Bible itself. Now, in the Bible, exposition always precedes application. That is, what God is doing precedes what you ought to do about it. You see that all over Scripture. Before the big application, the Ten Commandments, the Decalogue, before that, you will find, I'm the Lord your God. I brought you out of Egypt. I carried you as if on eagle's wings. What God has done. That's what exposition in your sermon is about. But application is what you do about what God has done. You see this in the Pauline epistles, Romans 1 through 11. Great statements about what God has done in faith and justification and sanctification and what he is doing in history in Israel. But then there's a turn. Romans 12:1. Therefore, be not conformed to this world, but be transformed in all how you ought to behave as a Christian. Same thing you see in Ephesians 1, 2, and 3. The mighty acts of God in choosing and saving and sanctifying and sealing and seated with him in heavenly places. But then what happens in 4:1? It's the end of the exposition and start of application. Therefore, walk worthy. You really haven't come to understand the passage unless you have some sense of how that passage ought to be applied in the lives of those who are listening to you. Now, that's easy to say, but of all the elements in preaching, to me, the hardest to do. To find in each movement and in the sermon as a whole, somewhere to nail this to the now, to rivet it to reality, to tie it to the times of the people listening to you. Now, let me give you the best suggestion I've got to give. And that is, when you have that exposition before you, you bombard that text in the silence of your study with the questions who, when, where, how, and what. Now, if you're familiar with journalism, those are the stories that are often answered, the questions that are often answered in the beginning of a news story. It's basic journalism 101. Who did this? When did they do it? Where did they do it? How did they do it? And of course, what did they do? If you will look at the text from which you're preaching and bombard that text with the questions, who is this talking to? When could this be done? How could it be done? Where could it be done? Now, you don't have to answer all of those, but you'll find that one of them usually brings along with it some of the others. Let's say a command like Paul's command, pray without ceasing. Maybe you've preached that, or you've preached from the parable of the importunate widow who kept on pestering the judge, or some other prayer passage. Time to apply that to the congregation. How do you pray without ceasing? Well, think of the people sitting out there for one thing. How does that sound to a middle school student? Pray without ceasing. You can apply it to a middle school student. You may apply it to anybody. First thing they probably think of is, I don't want to look weird. I don't want to look odd. I don't know anybody in my school that goes around praying without ceasing. Okay. So you locate them somewhere in school, in a desk, in a classroom. Ask them who is around them, friend in front or behind them, or maybe somebody beside them they don't even know, but that person is obviously depressed, or somebody whose home is breaking up, or somebody whose dad lost his job. Tell them this. You don't have to fall on your knees in a schoolroom. When the bell or the buzzer rings, let it be a reminder to say a prayer to somebody in front of them, behind them, on either side of them. That's all. That's just a sentence or two. It's just a little slice of life that they can think about. Or here's a new widow at home. It's 3 a.m. For 60 years, she's had someone beside her. And you're preaching on God has not given a spirit of fear, but of love and power and a sound mind. Picture her there. There's a noise. She's never heard that noise before in her life. Is that a tree brushing against the ceiling? Is it a wind? Is it somebody trying to get in downstairs? It's that time that a believer needs to say, God has not given me the spirit of fear, but of love and power and a sound mind. You made up a little slice of life that pictures the who, when, what, where, how of that story. Well, that is how you get at application. What application is not is simply raising the voice 100 decibels and say, you do this and you do this right now. It's good to give people a hint, a model, an idea, a suggestion about how to apply the sermon that they've been hearing. Now, those three things together are called the functional elements in the sermon. Now, let me give you a brief review. Monday work is reading your text in multiple translations, making notes from reading your text in multiple translations. Tuesday and Wednesday, you're reading 3 to 5 heavyweight, midweight commentaries, taking notes. Then Wednesday and Thursday, you're coming up with the big idea, that sermon in one sentence, the subject and the complement. What am I going to talk about and what am I going to say about it? That's what this sermon is about. It's like the theme sentence in a good theme, or the topical sentence in a good paragraph. What is this about before people hear it? So you then let that sermon grow like branches out of a tree, what naturally grows out of the text and that big idea. You don't have to impose it on the sermon. It grows naturally as the shape of that sermon. And then in every one of those branches, you're going to explain the text, you're going to illustrate the text, and you're going to apply the text, nail it to somebody's now. Who, when, where, how this might work. That's called enriching the sermon. Then you're going to write the sermon. I urge you, though, in writing it, to say it out loud before you write it, rather than write it and then say it. All along this process, you need to be talking out loud to yourself. I've done it for years. My family's gotten over it. My sons used to have friends over. They'd say, who your dad talking to? He's just preaching. Say it and then write it. There's a difference in written speech and oral speech. Hammer those moves out loud several times. Then write that down. The reason you write it down is that gives the opportunity to find the absolute perfect word rather than the almost right word. Now that's Thursday and Friday. What do you do then? My advice is put it down. Get away from it for 24 hours. It doesn't help as a preacher to be like a student standing in the hallway at school cramming 1 minute before the exam. Nobody ever did any better because of that. Put it down. Go out, play golf, go to a movie, do something family. Come back on Saturday afternoon, evening. Don't memorize it, but internalize it. Read each page. Put that page down and then say that out loud. And then pick the page up and read it again. Take the second page, read it out loud, put it down, say what you can remember, read it again through the whole sermon. Do that 3 times. And then make some notes that will help you mnemonically, help your memory on Sunday. Now, I'm not opposed to manuscript preachers. There are some excellent manuscript preachers who take the entire manuscript with them. I could name them, you would know them, don't have to name them. But they also have mastered the craft of not preaching to their notes, but preaching to the congregation, keeping their eyes on the church as they're preaching. I like to use the word internalize rather than memorize. If you memorize, you'll be looking out at the horizon, kind of spacey, like you're reading the message on the back wall of the church. Internalize the sermon. Even if you forget 20% of it, eye contact, engagement with the congregation more then makes up for that. And they don't know what you left out anyway. Nobody says, uh-oh, you left out that story in point 2. You know what I mean. Now, a great deal more could be said about introduction and conclusion, but those are other topics for other times. As Reverend Dr. Damone Johnson knows, I have an entire set of lectures like this on preaching. It's in a notebook with notes, expanded like the notes you have, 16 pages or so, and recorded lectures. If you're interested in that, it's called How to Preach. You can find that on my website. I've enjoyed spending this time with you talking about preaching. Now, we're going to take a break once again for your questions and answers. So if you have something that you want to ask about in terms of what we've discussed or preaching in general, let's have a moment of dialogue. And I want to again thank my friend, colleague in ministry, Reverend Dr. Damone Johnson, for giving me this opportunity. Thank you. I'm open now to any of your questions about this. If you'd like to take a while. The second part that I prepared for you gentlemen really had to do with what might be called enriching your sermon. And a good deal of that had to do with lived experience or sermon material. What characterizes it? What are some pitfalls and promises in using it in both illustration and application? So you have the first part of my lecture, the first 45 minutes, the second 45 minutes. I'm in your hands for whatever you'd like to ask.
Good afternoon, good sir. This is Reverend Trollinger from White Plains, New York.
Yes, sir.
I got called on, and I enjoyed hearing you say this, but I want you to build out on it for me. You said, don't memorize the sermon, but internalize the message. Are there methods in regards to that?
Well, thank you. Yes. I have found that when preachers memorize, they tend to get detached from the congregation. You're looking at the back of your head almost rather than engagement. I call it the teleprompter effect almost, but you don't have a teleprompter, but you tend to look at words out in the air somewhere if you memorized it. It just detaches preachers. When I say internalize, and I think I mentioned this, once you have a manuscript, which for me, say 6 or 7 pages, double spaced, type, 12-point type, would generally sustain 30 minutes. First of all, you've been working on that all week. You've been working on that all week. You don't have to memorize something you built. You've been titrating it into you all week. I advocate speaking it out, then writing the manuscript for refinement, to get the just right word instead of the almost right word, and to preserve your work. I say this, on Saturday, read a page, okay, Saturday evening, put it down and say as much as you can remember and pick it up and read it again. When you put it down, you're just trying to remember everything you can. When you reread it, you're reinforcing and correcting. Do that with page 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. You do it with each page of the sermon. Get up, walk away, then do that again. Same process, reinforcing. That's Saturday. And then Sunday morning, get up and do that again. And then when you go to the pulpit, take as little with you as you possibly can. My own experience would suggest you're going to remember 80% of that sermon. You're going to lose 20% of it. kind of mental leakage. But my own experience is, and a preaching professor like Robert Smith, Dr. Robert Smith at Beeson would say this, you gain more than you lose by engaging with eye contact and not having material distance because you have a piece of paper that is engaging. Now, in the very next breath, this is my caveat. There are great engaging manuscript preachers. There are. I think about Dr. William Curtis at Mount Ararat. I think about my longtime friend, Dr. Melvin Von Wade, manuscript preacher. It can be done, but to me, it's kind of a magic almost that you can engage people and have a manuscript. Now, I'll notice in some of my friends like that they know that manuscript so well that while they're looking at you, many of them will be turning pages. So it's there, but I've noticed often they're flipping pages without even looking at the pages, if that makes sense. That's my suggestion for a technique. And it's that I don't call it memorizing. And the reason not, it's not like I handed you a page from Shakespeare's Macbeth and said, memorize this. You're the Shakespeare. You wrote it. So it's been getting in you all week, and lean into that. Trust that, son. Somebody else.
Dr. Gregory, this is Harry Brown from Friendship Baptist Church in Ferndale, New York. I just have one question. What's the ideal length of a sermon now?
The ideal length.
Yeah.
I'm asked that, and almost every time I have a meeting, ideal length. Now, let me give a diagnostic answer rather than how many minutes. How long can you maintain unity and movement? How long can you be talking about one central thing and keep the sermon moving?
Mm-hmm.
If you look at it from the standpoint of the pew, how long can you keep going without the person in the pew asking one of two questions? What in the world is this about? That's the unity question. And where in the world is this going?
Mm-hmm.
That's the movement question.
Mm-hmm.
If you get in the head of people in the pew, that's the two things they're asking, whether they ask them exactly that way or not. What is this about and where is it going? Now, many preachers can maintain people past a half an hour, if they keep those two things in order. I find that some preachers after a half an hour lose at either one or both of those points. The sermon loses unity, and
Right.
people say, what's that about? Or it loses movement. They say, where in the world is that going?
Mm-hmm.
So my typical answer to that question is, as long as you can actually keep unity and movement, while understanding that going beyond a half an hour, some or many preachers start to fray. That is, the big idea starts to vaporize.
Mm-hmm.
You know, this is where you hear a preacher preaching on, say, Genesis 3, the fall and the expulsion from the garden, but all of a sudden, that preacher is at the Tower of Babel, or conquering the Holy Land with Joshua, are singing praises with David, and somehow winding up on Patmos with John, and somehow at the end of the sermon,
Right.
the big idea of
Diverge.
praise. Now that's an extreme example, but you see what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make some sense, Brother Brown?
Yes, yes, it does. Yeah, I was kind of looking at it in regards to if you don't have different Sunday morning services, you have elders, you have seniors, you have young adults, and then you have children. So, you know,
Yeah.
okay.
I
Thank
have
you.
a kind of funny word, aim at the middle schoolers. If you can keep middle schoolers engaged, you have you've achieved a remarkable thing if you can keep them with you some. I say that half tongue in cheek. You know, you have different generations listening capabilities. You do.
Yes,
In a tweeting, texting generation, you have a shorter attention
exactly.
span.
Yes.
I read a study not long ago that in Facebook posts, if the post is more than 90 words, people ignore it.
Right.
You know, they just look at it and say, that's 90 words.
Too much words.
That's about what you could read out loud in a minute and a half.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Dr.
Someone
Gregory,
else.
Dr. Gregory,
Yeah.
Dolly Ann Briggs Baptist Temple, Newburgh, New York. My late husband was a great manuscript reader. And one of the things that I gleaned from that reading is elementary, speaking intellectually, and preaching spiritually. But one of the things that he did drill into is always bring the conclusion back to Jesus Christ and the cross, but don't leave him on the cross, don't leave him in the grave, but
Right.
that he's risen. And generally, if you were to um, do that as far as keeping the focus on Jesus at the end, sermons are normally received, especially when you were talking about not focusing so much on yourself and your family, but the hero of the sermon, of course, is always Jesus. Could you speak a little more to,
Okay.
I know you
Right.
were talking about introductions and conclusions, but a little more to the conclusion with that regard, please?
I regret I didn't have time to deal with conclusions as much as I would in a longer time frame. There are in what you might call the Academy of Homiletics, and that is those who teach preaching, two schools of thought about always ending with Jesus. And they're not necessarily the same theological schools. In fact, they're not. You have mainline Protestants, such as well, I'm trying to think of both sides of the debate. You have, well, Eugene Peterson, the mainline Protestants who say, stay inside the text that you're speaking of. You have theological evangelicals like Walter Kaiser who say the same thing. If you're preaching from Job, stay in Job. On the other hand, you've got both mainline Protestants like Paul Scott Wilson and all kinds of evangelical theologians who say always end with Jesus. Now, I do belong to the latter category. The biblical defense for it is certainly in the last chapter of Luke, where the risen Christ, in a didactic situation with the two, Cleopas and the unnamed disciple, going to Emmaus, starting with Moses and all the prophets, hermeneuticize the things concerning himself. And if you want a rationale for it, Jesus, when he touched the Old Testament, touched it where it concerned him. The days of Jonah concerning him. So you have a biblical basis for ending with Jesus. but you must end legitimately. Now, here's what I mean by legitimately. I think I can get a little closer to you than the end of this table. I look like I'm at the end of the earth down here because of where our video equipment is.
It's okay.
We got we've got an $800 million a year budgeted university, and we're propping up cameras here. We're trying to do better.
Okay.
But uh, uh, there's a legitimate and illegitimate way to me to bring Jesus into the question. The illegitimate way is to make something up that's not inherent in that text. Okay. Now, let me give you an example of that. Here's a preacher, and I won't say the preacher's name, or a radio preacher. I won't name him to protect the guilty. But he was preaching on Noah, Shem, Ham, and Japheth putting pitch on the gopher wood of the ark. And he ended his sermon by saying, there you have the first type of propitiation. And our Lord Jesus propitiated the wrath of the what? That's just absolutely making something up. Now, that's not what it means to bring in Jesus.
No.
What it means to bring in Jesus legitimately is to move from whatever your text is, okay, from that text to something Christological.
Mm-hmm.
Say if Job is asking the question, if a man die, shall he live again? Jesus answered that question. I am the resurrection and the life.
Mm-hmm.
Following me?
Yep.
If Nehemiah is building a wall in 444 BC to save Jerusalem, what is it saved for ultimately? His generation died. Ptolemies and Seleucids died. Alexander the Great took the city, died. The Romans under Pompey took the city and died. But those walls and their successors held together that city until that day when a 12-year-old boy came up from Jerusalem and said, I must be about my Father's business. And then 20 years later, he came in those walls on Palm Sunday and carried a cross out of those walls. Now that's how you get from Nehemiah to Jesus. Am I making any sense?
Yes.
There's nothing in any text that there's not a legitimate way. Now here's a book. Grydanus, Gradanus at Calvin College, Grydanus, Preaching Christ from the Old Testament. Grydanus. If you want to talk about legitimately doing it, that's a good book.
Okay.
But don't drag Jesus in when he's saying, don't drag me up there and fasten me to that text that way, okay?
Right.
There's a way to get legitimately to Christ from any subject, anything.
Dr. Gregory?
Yes, sir.
This is Jesse Bottoms from Beulah Church in Poughkeepsie, New York. In line with the very question, in line with the very question that Pastor Briggs was asking, when there is Old Testament preaching or what we call pastoral preaching that does not easily lend itself to an altar call or an invitation to Christian discipleship, can you say a word about that?
Yes. In my experience of Baptist life, somewhat regionally here in the Southwest, but with considerable experience nationally, more and more I'm seeing some sermons end without a formal altar call. Now that can be debated. We got more than 6,000 Baptist churches here in Texas, and I'd say in the majority of those churches, they'd still think something went really wrong if you didn't give an altar call. But I'm also seeing, and this is an observation increasingly, where the sermon itself, say in these days, may be a lament And God knows there have been opportunities in these last 16 months to touch the lamenting passages of Scripture, the lamenting Psalms, laments from the prophets. I think there's some preachers who find another opportunity, if you would, to end the service. Now, here's my qualification about that. Does that produce shock, S-H-O-C-K, in the congregation? Communication stops when you produce shock. If you're in a church that feels like the world stopped and heaven closed and you don't give an altar call, then you do not want to produce shock. Shock stops communication. Am I making sense?
I'm following.
I think if you're in a place where it would not produce shock for you to do something alternative, I want to say, yes, there are occasions when the service might end some other way. Now, I say that knowing right here where I'm sitting in Central Texas, that I'm surrounded by churches that would think what I just said was semi-heretical, if not heretical. You just don't preach without an altar call. I am observing, however, more instances where that is happening, particularly in these kinds of days where we have had to turn, due to the national situation, oftentimes to sermons of lament.
Dr. Gregory, Joe Covington, Albany, New York, Mount Calvary. I have two questions. One, you talked about building discernment throughout the week. The first question is, what time factor would you connect with that? How many hours quality should we spend in building discernment? And the second question is, at times I use props and in the sermon as examples for building. Can you expand on that a little also?
Thank you. Good questions. And Reverend Covington, I'm sorry, I should have said that. My system that I talked about is based on a total of 12 hours. As it were, 2 a day, Monday through Saturday. It's based on a 12-hour system. Now, this comes not only out of my own practice, but it comes out of talking to plenty of preachers. Preaching is not all you do. You know, unless you're somebody, you know, that's a preaching elder in a church, and that's, everybody else takes care of everything else, you know. You take somebody like John MacArthur Jr., all he does is preach, whether you agree with him or not. He's got elders that deal with everything else, you know. There's some settings like that. I was never, even in mega churches, I was never in that situation. I had to do some of everything else. Yeah. Some marry, some bury, some counsel, some, and I couldn't get away from it. I think in the typical work week of a preacher, and I'm talking about for one fully manuscripted sermon, if you can take 2 hours on the average, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, that's 6, okay? 2 hours Thursday and Friday, manuscripting, and a couple hours of rehearsal, so to speak, you have done well. I can say with conviction and experience, if the preaching pastors in America were to do that, it would be a noteworthy impact within a number of weeks. There'd be a lot of talking about, well, man, what happened to the preacher? He's in another, he's in another universe. I'm pretty convinced that that doesn't happen by and large across all preaching preparations in America. That way, if you look at, and I don't know how you look at it, what's a preacher's work week? Who can say what a preacher's work week is? When I was pastoring, I never saw a 40-hour work week. That was kind of where things started, I'd say. I mean, doing things for the church. 60 would have been way more like it. So, you know, you're spending, if it's a 60-hour week, counting Sundays and everything you do in ministry, you're spending, you know, 20% of that time getting ready to preach. You don't own that square yard behind the pulpit. You lease it, and you lease it by doing a lot of other stuff. You, you, you pay the lease to stand there by doing many other things, and I recognize that. So my estimate is 12 hours. Now back to your thing about props. What I know about props is they either work or they don't. Be sure that it works or the sermon is over. Now, just that's all I can say. Be sure it works. If it works, it helps. If it doesn't, it's sermon ending. And I've seen it both ways. I had a stewardship speaker one time that held up $1 and said, if you will tithe, God will stretch your dollar. And what none of us knew was it was a rubber dollar bill. And he stretched it. Well, the sermon was over. You'd have to know that church and that congregation across the street from a seminary. The sermon was over. I think everybody knew it but the preacher, which is always pathetic, but all the rest of us knew it was over. Then I've seen very good props. Okay? When I was preaching from the Potter chapter on Jeremiah 18, I brought in a potter and a wheel, and we rehearsed it together. And he made a beautiful piece of pottery up to the point of the passage where God made it again, and he smashed that thing. There's a real gasp in the congregation, and made it again, a different kind of pot. It worked. So I say about props, they're okay if you know they're going to work, you know. You know, I've seen them that didn't. I had a student preacher at another school years ago preaching from Isaiah 40. You wait on the Lord, you'll mount up with wings as eagles. And inside the pulpit, he'd hidden one of those little balsa wood planes. If you remember, with a propeller, you could wind up on a rubber band. At a certain age, you may remember those. You'd wind up the propeller and you could turn that little plane loose. Well, when he said mount up with wings as eagles, he grabbed that thing, turned it loose. Well, it sailed over the heads of the kids in the congregation at the seminary and hit the back wall and crashed. And when we talked about his sermon, exactly what point were you making when your airplane crashed against the back wall? I mean, everybody was out of the sermon. It's a prop that didn't work. And I know he meant well, but it just didn't work. I mean, so that's what I'd say. If you're sure they work, they can help.
Dr. Gregory, Sam Perry, Second Baptist Church, Middletown, New York.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing with us today. I got a lot out of it. And to the moderator and the vice moderator for making this happen. I'm on the job right now. I'm stealing time to listen in on this. And I came because I felt like it was necessary. Anything that I can do to become more effective, I'm looking to do. I work a secular job, and my required hours are 60 hours a week. The last week of the month, it's probably more like 80. And I work in a business where I have to be available when the customer wants you available, the client. And I'm in about an hour and 10 minutes without traffic from my church. And I have, a wife and a family also. So these principles that you outlined today, which are proven and certainly I agree with, my question to you is, are those, is that something for my situation, which I just outlined to you, is putting the plan that you said together in my work week, is that practical? Is it possible? Do I need to be better at managing time, or because I already have my wife always, she feels like she needs to get saved again in order to get some of my time. so I'm dealing with those sort of issues. My biggest challenge is trying to find time. Now I do eat the text on Monday. I try to do that and digest it, but I may not have a text. I may not have my text or my topic for Sunday. I got a 12-hour day on Sunday. I mean on Monday. So I'm just trying to recover from Sunday, and then, I'm 12 hours on the job on Monday. So I really don't get to a topic till Tuesday. So that's I just wanted to ask you, in light of my situation, what would be your suggestion? Thank you.
Well, thank you for that. And almost every setting I preach in, there are not just one, but sometimes a number of bivocational preachers. The suggestion, and I would not press down on you the model I've described as a day-to-day model. Several things I typically say in answer to that, by experience and observation, teaching many bivocational students at seminaries and in conferences like this. First of all, I think it is more important for you to have a plan than anybody. That way you do wake up Monday morning knowing where you're going. I think a plan is of enormous consequence for bivocational people, so that you absolutely are not fighting to decide what a text is the week before you preach it. So first of all, a plan. Now, how you can steal time to do that, working those kind of hours, that's going to have to be creativity. Secondly, always keep materials with you. If you have a plan and to this Sunday, I'm preaching from Mark 8 on the man who saw people like trees walking. Whether it's Logos or some other two, Logos Libronics, or whether you copy it, always have commentary material with you. I can stress that too much. Unless it's an extraordinary job in which you never have a moment of downtime. At some point, maybe even while you're wolfing down lunch, you can catch 20 minutes to read exegetical material on your text. Have it with you, read it actively, mark it, underscore it, highlight it, okay? Steal some time where you can during the week, but that depends on two things. You've planned your preaching, okay? And you have some materials with you because you have planned it, all right? Does that make sense? So all I can say there is those two things. It's more important for bivocational preachers than anybody to know where you're going, so you can know what material to take with you, so you can steal time in chunks. 20 minutes here, 30 minutes there, waiting for a client in the car, whatever your situation is. The discipline of stealing time. Now, there's one other plus to me in bivocational preaching, and that is you're so much, quote, in the real world, that I do think you have a leg up when it comes to lived experience or illustrations.
Yes, sir.
You're out there thrown into real, unedited life, And here's what I mean by unedited life. Most people edit their life a little when the preacher's around, Like more than one time as a pastor here in Texas, knocking on somebody's front door, I heard a kid scream out inside, "Oh, Daddy, put the beer up, it's the preacher," that kind of thing. You run into edited situations as preachers. Or Daddy, turn that movie off, it's the preacher. I've heard that. You're out there in, quote, if I could put it that way, real life. And I think bivocational preachers at the point of application, and in many cases illustration, you have an experience of thinking about that text in the middle of real work life situations. And that's a plus, it's not a minus.
Yes, sir.
That's what I'd say about that.
If I can
Thank you.
just, if I can jump in right here, just want to let everybody know, because some people did come on late, that if we have your email and you're getting the Central Hudson emails, we will send you a link to the video of this if you got in late, and if you may have to leave early, we'll make sure that you get the videos if you have to leave early as well. But if you have Central Hudson, if you're in Central Hudson, we have your email. But I see Pastor Norman Scott on here. If he could drop his email in the chat, I'll make sure that he gets that too.
Let's
And
do.
let me say this to
oh.
Dr. Johnson and also to everybody. I'm a bit constricted here in my day. Dr. Johnson, I'll be pleased if anybody wanted to set a time next week or whatever after everybody's listened to this to get back together. I'd look at that as a great opportunity.
Sure.
If you'd like to think about that and poll everybody next week, if everybody's listened, email whenever they listen. If we'd like to get back together for some more Q&A, I'll be happy to make time to do that. Would that make sense, Damone?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
I'll be
Thank you.
happy to. Let
Okay.
me say 2 or 3 things to wrap this up just because of my own obligations, and I regret that. I'm obligated today in a way I will not be next week. 2 or 3 other resources that I have. I think I mentioned my extended lectures on preaching are in a set called How to Preach. It's a file folder that has a vast expansion of this outline and audio recordings. Second thing is, I do a 4-day seminar called Proclaimer's Place. I've done 105 of them in 20 different states over the last 15 years. That's where I come to where you are, and I spend 4 days, 9 to noon and 1 to 3 for 3 days, and 9 to noon the 4th day. And Dr. Johnson has been to these. I don't know if anybody else has, but he can tell you about it. If there were ever any desire in your area, I do that by invitation. I come to you. And we take a text a day. And I do it moving from text to precept, rather than what I did in these lectures, moving from precept to text. In Proclaimer's Place, we work off a text and let everything arise out of the study of that text. I give you a huge notebook. Dr. Johnson knows about it. A third thing are just activities I'm engaged in, enriching preaching. This September 28, 29, and 30, September 28, 29, and 30 will be the 3rd annual Baylor's Truett Seminary National Conference, African American Preaching. We have 8 different preachers. You would know the name, many of them, Dr. Ralph West, Bishop Kenneth Ulmer, and so forth and so forth. It's on our website. We'd be delighted to have you to come to Texas, to come to Central Texas. The subtitle of it is Where Preaching Meets the Academy. Where Preaching Meets the Academy. That's what it is. 2 years ago, we had more than 400 here live and in person. Last year, we had more than 500 virtually. So we're looking forward to these days. That's Tuesday morning at 11 through Thursday afternoon here in Central Texas. You can fly into DFW, or you can fly right into Waco if you want to go on American Eagle. Just want to say that's one of our resources. It is a live and in-person conference. You should be able to get it later, but this year we're intending to make it live and in person. So those are 3 resources I could mention: How to Preach, my recordings, teaching, preaching, Proclaimer's Place, if you were ever interested in that, either in your area or coming to one of them, Dr. Johnson generally knows where they are, or our residential conferences here at Baylor University. Some people don't know it, and I've come where I say it because, you know, we presume in this neck of the woods, everybody knows Baylor's a Baptist university. Baylor University is a Baptist founded university, founded in 1845 by Texas Baptist pioneers under the Republic of Texas, before Texas was a state. Baylor's older than Texas, and we are 40 years older than that school down the interstate from us called the University of Texas. I just like to say that. It just makes me feel good to say that. But we are Baptist University, a research university with 19,000 students here in Central Texas. So we'd be happy to host you if you come.